Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Freeston. I'm Director of Quality Improvement here at the Preschool Learning Alliance, and I'm joined today by Melanie Pilcher, Policy and Standards Manager.
Good afternoon.
You're joining us today to consider the essential importance of self-evaluation in light of recent changes from Ofsted in terms of the mechanisms through which self-evaluation is recorded. So it's a very timely webinar this afternoon. As always, as well as broadcasting live to the attendees who we have with us, this session is being recorded and will be made available on the Preschool Learning Alliance's website, YouTube page, and therefore will be able to be enjoyed at any time, even at your leisure. And also, I'm sure we'll link to other resources the Preschool Learning Alliance has created around self-evaluation, and Melanie will talk us through that as we go through today. My role is to act as chair. For those of you who have not attended one of our webinars before, don't be scared. As the name suggests, they are basically a seminar, but are broadcast on the web rather than us all being in the room. It allows us to reach far greater numbers of people, but works in a very similar way, that we try and do a 15 to 20 minute presentation, and then we allow a period of time for question and comments. But these sessions work best, especially with a topic as contentious, I would say, at times as self-evaluation, that it operates as a dialogue. So if you feel at any point you wish to make a comment or ask a question, do please type that into the question box you have on your toolbar. That pops up on the screen here. Nobody else can see it, so don't be embarrassed about misspellings or anything. And I try and weave those seamlessly, or not, into the conversation as Mel works through the presentation. So that is the control panel you should have, and as I say, you have a type-in free text box that allows you to ask us any questions. So from that position around general introduction, I will hand you over to Melanie, and then I will act as the informed other with our dialogue. Melanie.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. The topic this afternoon has been triggered by Ofsted's announcement some 2 months ago that they were going to remove their optional online early years self-evaluation form. And the reason given for them doing that was that they wanted to reduce the burden on providers. And I will challenge that as we go along and discuss that a little bit further. But what I wanted to do this afternoon was to look at the essence of good self-evaluation, because although Ofsted's SEF is no longer available to us and was never compulsory, self-evaluation is. And I think it's something that we as providers need to be very aware of and turn our attention to before we get inspected, and the inspector will be looking for evidence of your self-evaluation. So what I wanted to start by saying is that self-evaluation is an essential leadership and management function for any sector or industry. And that's whether you're evaluating the performance of your product, for example, a motor vehicle, or a service that you offer, such as hairdressing. You don't wait for the customers to stop coming through the door before or buying your product before you ask yourself the questions, how well are we performing and what do we need to do to improve? And so that is our starting point. I wanted to just spend some time as well thinking about what self-evaluation is. And sometimes it's very similar to the whole concept of reflective practice. People sometimes get very bogged down in the terminology and are actually thinking that it must be something more than the simple thing that it actually is. Self-evaluation is the means by which we get an accurate view of the quality of our provision. And it's simply asking ourselves the question, how well are we performing against the set criteria? And in this instance, the set criteria is the inspection schedule. It's the criteria that Ofsted use when they're actually inspecting.
And that is publicly available?
It is publicly available, not always easy to find, but it is on the Ofsted website. And if you just type in inspection schedule, if you look at anything to do with early years, it will come up in a side panel and you will see all the documents relevant to it. So as I said, it's really a set of questions. Are we meeting the expectations that we have for ourselves and that others have of us? What are our strengths and weaknesses? Why are we stronger or weaker in certain areas? What do we need to do to improve, and how and when will we make the changes that we need to make? In other words, how do we action plan? And of course, self-evaluation is work in progress. It has no beginning and no end. One of the things that did worry me about having a set format for self-evaluation was the fact that people tended to think that when they'd done Ofsted self-evaluation, it was a task to be completed, they could then upload it and it was done. And that should never have been the case, because the self-evaluation form that Ofsted produced was always meant to be a working document if you used it. As I mentioned before, self-evaluation does cause some level of anxiety for people. And so I just wanted to break it down a little bit into the simplest of terms. People do look for the hidden meaning, but I've just identified some key elements. Self-evaluation involves reflection, and we're all familiar with this. It's something that we do all the time in our work with children, reflecting on our own practice, reflecting on how well children are learning and developing, and reflecting all the time on what we could do differently or better. Evaluation is simply examining what we do in more detail, assessing the effectiveness and the condition of our practice, and making a judgment about how effective we are. And one of the other points that I wanted to make was on Ofsted's self-evaluation form. At the end of each section, Ofsted would ask you to make a judgment based on the same 4 judgments that Ofsted would make. Do you think you're outstanding? Do you think you're good? Do you think you requires improvement? Do you think you're inadequate? Inadequate. So I think this has always been a challenge for people, isn't it? Because we're not very good at being honest about where we think we are. I think we're often frightened to say, well, we're outstanding, in case somebody challenges us and proves otherwise. And we're also often worried about saying that we're inadequate in case somebody expects us to have improved and we haven't yet done so.
In your usual way, Melanie, I think you could also argue that you're being too nice. I spent a lot of time reading self-evaluation forms.
Yes.
And many of them were purely descriptive, pages and pages of description about what is done, without any sense of, is it any good? Mm-hmm. And I think there was an assumption with self-evaluation that people are innately good at it, but actually that's not the case. It's a skill and a challenge that can be learned and taught, and actually we just expected people to be able to do it without any of that support at times, and that was really didn't serve us as the sector particularly well.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And even with Ofsted's guidance that told us what we should be doing with our self-evaluation, people still tended to want to to populate the whole form with a list of what they were doing.
I would throw this open to colleagues listening in on, if they were honest, how good were they? How truthful and judgmental were their self-evaluation activities? Would you challenge me on the view that actually the sector wasn't necessarily particularly skillful at making judgments about itself? Please do let us know your comments.
Thank you, Michael. And then, of course, the other element of self-evaluation has to be the actions that we take to maintain and improve our practice. And again, this is where I think Michael alluded to, we found that people were falling short in the way that they were actually self-evaluating, that the list was there, this is what we do, but no recognition of this is what we could do better, or this is what we need to do to change.
Sorry, Melanie, I do have to say, Sarah, she's been the first. I was saying, We felt ours was very good, and we were told so by the inspector, so I feel corrected.
That's really nice to know, and also justifies my belief that Ofsted were wrong to remove the self-evaluation form in the first place, because it did have value.
Penny has said the sound is dropping out a lot, and I'm getting strange echoes too. Thank you for letting me know, Penny. Is that better, and is anybody else suffering from the same point? Are we closer, Penny? I've just made a couple of adjustments. Let me try and turn it up. But we have been having problems all day.
It's the sunshine.
Yeah, we can't cope with the heat. Anybody else having any problems? Or it says a couple of people are typing. Sally said hers is okay.
Okay. I am going to come closer to the mic.
And we're still echoing. Thank you, Penny. We will keep moving the mic around. I've got it on low echo, but there we go. Talk straight into it now.
I will indeed. Thank you. There was a certain pop singer, wasn't there, that used to sort of caress the mic and hold it very close when they were. Okay, fine, thank you. The final point that I wanted to make on the elements of self-evaluation is the importance of taking ownership of it, and not just the person or one person, but actually as a whole team, so that we're very clear about who is responsible for taking action, who's responsible for contributing to self-evaluation in the first place. So I just felt that was a useful little exercise for myself as well, to help me to get my thoughts in order. And of course, really important, what are we evaluating? Well, I mentioned before that ultimately we are evaluating our performance against the inspection judgments, just as Ofsted will do when they're inspecting you. So we've got the 4 judgments here: the effectiveness of leadership and management, quality of teaching and learning, personal development, behaviour and welfare, and outcomes for children. And Michael, this is something that I've heard you stand up and say in public before now. Ofsted set the test, but they have given us the answers.
All of the information that inspectors use to plan and undertake any inspection is provided in the public domain. So there are no surprises that you should be fearful of, because you can do the preparation in advance of them coming. And actually, it also indicates in that documentation that if they do focus on things which are outside of that schedule, those become your grounds for appeal, because it is very tightly defined, both in terms of how the process should take place, but also what are the areas of focus. There should be no surprises, so you can plan for it.
Thank you, Michael. For me, an indication of poor leadership and management is often that the leader doesn't know what it is they don't know. And that's where the inspection schedule is so important, because it tells us what we need to know. As Michael said, it gives us the answers. And when that's the case, we find that managers carry on blindly, believing that everything is fine and that they're doing a good job. At one time, I would have said that those answers were to be found first and foremost in the EYFS, but I do believe that the inspection schedule has become our go-to place if we want to make sure we're doing everything that we need to do. And there are 2 key documents actually that are involved with inspection. And the first one is, of course, the Early Years Inspection Handbook, which I've alluded to. And the second one is, equally important, the Inspecting Safeguarding in Early Years. Both of those are available on Ofsted's website. As we progress now through the slides and discuss how we evaluate, these are the key documents that I will keep referring back to. So where is self-evaluation referred to now? So if Ofsted have removed the optional self-evaluation form from their website, do they still refer to it in the inspection documents? Yes, they do. It remains in the inspection schedule, and we have references such as providers must demonstrate how they evaluate their service and strive for continuous improvement. And Ofsted also identify for us that the key elements of this include the views of children, staff, parents, and any staff or assistants you employ.
Sorry, Melanie. A question in from Jamelia, and I think I may have just preempted you slightly.
Okay.
Do I have to use a particular form for my SEF? And if so, where do I get one from?
Okay. If you've been previously using Ofsted SEF and you've downloaded it, then my recommendation is strongly that you carry on doing so. Obviously, you won't any longer be able to upload it, but it's there, it's still valid, it's still relevant, and you can just carry on using it, keep it yourself electronically, but have a printed off copy that you can actually give to an inspector as well. There isn't a set form. What I would say is if you were going to create your own, it would be easy enough to do, but just doing it under those inspection criteria headings, which is one of the reasons why we haven't actually developed a form for people to use. I've focused instead on actually the action planning that should be drawn from your self-evaluation. And I will tell you as we move on where those things can be found.
And I think just to make I shall pose the comment as a question. In essence, and I think possibly at times, sometimes the frustration or confusion about the use of a self-evaluation form is arguably it has two purposes. One is in terms of the documentation for Ofsted, I've got to do this, but the other is as an effective tool for your own organisation's self-improvement. And there might be things, if we're being honest and candid with Ofsted, that may not come maybe in the benefit of the organisation as a whole. So this is very much your organisation's document. Be honest with it, because otherwise inspectors will pick up on those bits where it doesn't align with what they see during the inspection.
It's very easy to see a self-evaluation form that's been completed as a task. As opposed to one that is a working document. And that's also a timely reminder that actually self-evaluation may comprise of many different documents drawn from many different sources. So it might be that you've drawn from previous inspection report, from a report from somebody from the local authority, or other professionals that have come into your setting. So self-evaluation doesn't necessarily have to be one document, but I think it's how you can show how you've summarised, how you've applied the self-evaluation that's been done to those inspection judgments, and how you've drawn that all together. I think that's the important part of it. I did want to just remind us as well that in the past, inspectors would have accessed your online SEF as they made their preparations to inspect you. And of course, this will no longer be the case, which is, I think, a shame. Although the inspector would not have begun to make any judgments by reading your SEF, it would certainly have given them a flavour of your setting and an idea of how rigorous your self-evaluation was. And that's something they will continue to seek evidence of as they inspect you.
Just picking up on that, I had a question in from Sam, and I think this reflects back that notion of the SEF sometimes being seen as a chore. We are a sessional setting. Our leader insisted that it was the chair's job to complete our SEF and submit it online because we do not have internet access. What will happen now?
Poor old chair, that's what I say. As previously, I would have said to you, even if you were still able to submit it online, I would have said to you that it's a whole setting responsibility to contribute to that SEF. And chairs are simply facilitators for enabling things to get done. They don't necessarily have to do it for you. And yes, you might have a chair who has the time to actually put it all together, but the information still needs to come from the practitioners, from the preschool leader, in order to be able to inform that process. So whatever format your future SEF actually takes, it's got to come from within the setting. Okay. Within the inspection schedule as well, Ofsted referred to the need for the inspector to be clear with the provider about how each judgment was awarded. And this is where the really useful dialogue between the inspector and the manager during feedback would help to clarify with the provider why a particular inspection judgment had been given. A discussion could then be had which helps the provider to understand, for example, why they've been graded satisfactory in an area that they believe they were outstanding in. And this is really helpful in supporting the provider to make the necessary improvements rather than misunderstanding and feeling hard done by. I can't tell you how many calls we get into our information services from providers who feel aggrieved that they have been given a judgment that they really believe they didn't deserve. And part of that dialogue with the inspector is about actually being able to understand why your assessment of what you should have been given differs from that of the inspector. And I do hope that that continues with Ofsted as we see the online self-evaluation form disappearing. Nobody deliberately aims or requires improvement, so it's more than often the case that they have just misunderstood the requirements in the first place. Thank you, Michael. The other elements of self-evaluation that Ofsted say that we should be looking for, the views of other professionals who may work with you, such as local authority advisors, development workers, health professionals, children's centre staff, and other early years provision. And then they also identify that your self-evaluation must contain your strengths, any areas for improvement, and the actions that you propose to tackle them. And this is where, as I said, Ofsted CEF was so useful because it directed us in those areas. What I'm going to do is move on now and actually look at each of those elements in a little bit more detail. So how do we evaluate, Ofsted say, the views of children, staff and parents? So how do we hear the voice of the child in the setting? In order to consult with young children, we have to look, listen and hear. And I think that formal consultation with children often only asks the questions that we want the answers to and doesn't always take into account the things that the children want to tell us. I'm always reminded of a story of a local authority that I was involved in when we had funding in early years. Do you remember those good old days, Michael? And we were given money to find out what was important to children in an out-of-school provision, so slightly older children. And we as development officers devised all sorts of activities aimed at planning the layout and resources of an exemplary out-of-school club. We got children together, we got them to do all sorts of wonderful activities. We asked them for their views, we asked them what made them feel safe, what equipment they'd like, what staff should do. And with the funding, we were then tasked with producing a report that would inform other out-of-school provision in the area. And do you know what came out on top for the children?
I daren't say.
The most important thing to those children was clean toilets with no pee over the seats, please.
I'm glad I didn't offer a suggestion.
It was a wonderful thing to write into a formal report, believe me. But I think that made us all stop and think, actually, that we were steering the children towards what we thought we wanted to know, but actually this was what was more important. So when we're listening to the voices of children, or when we're trying to get the voice of children to come across, we need to look, listen and hear. How effective are we at gaining the views of parents? And this is something, another little bugbear of mine, the inefficiency of the old suggestion box on the wall for both staff and parents. When you open those boxes up, they usually have one piece of the puzzle that's been missing for 6 months, by the way, which has been posted by one of the children. So a bit of fluff, a dead spider, sometimes a crayon. In the case of parents, it's a suggestion that you reduce your fees. And the suggestion from the staff is usually that they deserve a pay rise. So that form of consultation with parents and staff is not effective. So thinking about other ways that we can actually get that feedback. More than anything, people want to see positive action as well. That so you said this and we did that and this is how we changed. The other thing to think about is that there's often unsolicited feedback, but that's more likely to be in the form of a written or verbal complaint. Yes. People are often motivated to actually give you feedback when something's gone wrong. So I think being able to actually generate that feedback in a more positive manner is really important. I've just put a few things here that we can do. Consultation, as I said, in making it meaningful and not steering it towards what we think we want to hear. Questionnaires are always helpful. There's always the challenge of getting people to complete them and return them. That general feedback, thinking about the many, many ways that people feed back to you. Observation of children. Our observation tells us so much about what children like, what they enjoy, what they're accessing. And we need to use that in a much wider remit than just thinking about the child's learning and development, but what it's actually telling us about how we can improve our practice. And of course, supervision as well. This is something I just had to give it its own slide, I'm sorry, but evaluation is not simply a list of what you do against each criteria, and I've read enough self-evaluation forms to know that that is so often the case, and we did discuss that earlier, didn't we?
But it is worth restating, both in red, as you have done, and I'll allow you an exclamation mark as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So what we want to do then, and I just wanted to add this in as well, because one area that I often see in inspection reports, and I do scrutinise a lot of inspection reports, is that the evaluation of teaching and learning is often the area that people fall down in, most of all. So I wanted to actually spend some time, although one area isn't more important than the other in terms of self-evaluation, this is certainly the area that people fall down on most. So thinking about who monitors the quality of teaching and learning in your setting and how do they do it, and I will say peer observation to you. We've got a lot of resources available on that. Do you have a clear approach to teaching and learning that is communicated well amongst your team and is shared by everybody? Is every member of staff clear about what good teaching and learning looks like? Because not only is one person evaluating the quality of teaching and learning, but we want each individual to evaluate for themselves as well how good they are. And the most important thing, and the thing people often struggle with, is can they explain their approach to teaching and learning to other people? And again, that's something that that's where the inspector catches people out.
Yes.
When they talk to an individual practitioner about their approach to teaching and learning, and the practitioner is stumped. They know what they're doing and they can do it, but they can't explain it to somebody else.
I'll put this in now, but you might want to answer it in a second. This question is coming from Tash, and I think it brings us back to the summary of this. So are you saying I don't have to have a written CEF now?
Ofsted have always said that whether you use their online CEF, whether you have your own format of self-evaluation, it doesn't necessarily have to be written. I have not yet met anybody or read a report where the self-evaluation was proved verbally. So I would say do use written form of self-evaluation, whatever form that takes. And as I said, even if it's collating the documents that actually contribute towards your self-evaluation, as long as you're clear about the actions that you take from those, about how you apply that against the inspection judgments, what you use is up to you.
I'm genuinely struggling here to think about how you would do it if it wasn't written down and collated somewhere else. If there was the manager was able to articulate the self-evaluation process in the setting, that's fine, but clearly the first instinct then from the inspector would be to make sure that understanding is shared by the entire staff team.
Yes.
Which you might get round by actually just presenting the policies document. And also there is all the potential for the manager to be not in the setting on the day of the inspection through illness or any other reason. So I struggle. I'd be interested in other people have views on how you would do it without there being supporting written documentation.
The way I actually see this is that an inspector might enter a really good setting, a setting where obviously there are reflective practitioners, where obviously self-evaluation is embedded into their practice. And I would imagine that the inspector would then want to dig deeper to search for that self-evaluation by having that dialogue with the manager. And I think you can observe a reflective practitioner without actually having to read evidence of them as reflective practitioners. But it's only part of the package, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay.
I think I know.
No, that's right. Yes.
Okay. And just to move on the teaching and learning, just 3 key points really: that every member of staff should be knowledgeable about how children learn and develop, be clear about what good teaching looks like, taking account of the individual needs of their group, be informed about what Ofsted consider to be effective teaching, and that's what feeds into your evaluation, self-evaluation. And you can talk to the inspector about that, can't you?
Most of it.
So what next? Okay, so we now have no online SEF. That's fine. I'm not worried about that. I do wonder if Ofsted will end up regretting that decision, but the proof of the pudding will be in future inspection reports where we see how self-evaluation is referred to. So really it's about drawing upon all the information that Ofsted will be looking for. We've gone through that in quite a bit of detail there. Reflecting on it to identify your strengths, any areas for improvement, and the actions that you need to take. And this is your action planning. Place it against the inspection outcomes, making sure that you're using the language that's used in the inspection schedule. So what does the inspection criteria say? There are your answers. We've set the test and there are your answers. How did you think you were doing? How do the rest of the team think you're doing? How do you think you're doing now? And then present your self-evaluation to the inspector at the start of the inspection in whatever form that actually takes. That's all that I wanted to say about self-evaluation. I think we could probably do 2 or 3 different webinars on the different elements of self-evaluation. But what I wanted to do was just signpost you to some of the things that we have created in anticipation of future needs now that self-evaluation online has gone. We have put an update into our observation, assessment and planning book. If you've already got the book, then you will be able to get an online update to that, and you will have the code for doing so. And we have created and recently launched, I think it is the latest Educare module that is free to all our members, and details of how to access those Educare modules are available on our website as well. So that's it from me, Michael, unless you've got any further comments.
No, I shall just make a couple of comments as I provide an opportunity for people to type in any last few questions. For those of you who've been with us before on these, we tend not to artificially extend the sessions, but I will just talk for a second if there are a couple of any questions that you feel needs to come out. For me, I think it is disappointing Ofsted's position that self-evaluation forms were seen as an additional burden, because that does create a context in which it's seen as a procedural tool that needs to be done rather than an essential service and opportunity to regularly reflect from the whole team's perspective on how a setting is improving. And just one other thought that came to me as you were talking, where it's easy to spot where a self-evaluation form has been written as a procedural document. The other thing that Ofsted inspectors always tell me is they can always spot when it's been written by one person.
Yes.
Yes. Where it's clearly an individual's reflection on what the setting is like, and that becomes easily unstable when they go and have early conversations with other members of the team or anybody else. So early years provision in group care settings is a team game. Yes. Therefore, the self-evaluation process and the reflection that goes with it also has to be a shared activity.
And it's unique to the setting. And I remember in the early days of self-evaluation where some local authorities were actually providing text for providers to actually place in their self-evaluation, because it was seen as that task. And I think over time it's evolved and people do recognise it, and Ofsted value it as a working document.
Okay, us going on there for a bit longer gave opportunity. A question didn't, and no questions did come in, So it just allows me to draw the session to a close, to offer my thanks to Melanie for leading today's session. Hopefully you have found it useful. The references on the final slide are to the other services and resources we have made available. As I said at the beginning, by the end of the week, tomorrow, this recording of this session will be available on the YouTube site for you to enjoy at your leisure. It only remains for me to say thank you for attending and enjoy the sunshine. Take care. Bye-bye.